In the first week of March 1892 in the territory of Dakota, two things happened on the same night that would be remembered for years by everyone who lived within a day's ride of either one. The first was that a man named Caspar Colgrove stood on the porch of a woman's house in the middle of the worst storm anyone in the territory had ever seen. Frost covered his beard so thick it looked like the beard itself had turned white overnight. Two fingers on his right hand had stopped feeling anything about an hour before he arrived, and he did not know yet whether they would come back or whether the cold had taken them for good. He was not there to ask for help. He was not there to borrow anything or deliver news. He was there because everything he knew about surviving winter had failed him in the space of a single night, and he needed to stand somewhere that was still standing. The woman opened the door and pulled him inside without a word. The second thing that happened that night a few miles to the north was quieter and would not be discovered for several days. An old man named Whitfield Osterhout lay down in his own barn 30 steps from his own front door, and those 30 steps had become a distance no living person could cross. By the time the storm broke and someone thought to check on him, Whitfield was gone, and the snow between his barn and his house was smooth and unbroken, as if no one had ever tried. 10 months before that storm, the woman who opened her door to Caspar Colgrove had been considered by nearly everyone in that part of the territory to have lost her mind entirely. And the old man who dotted 30 steps from home was the only person who had never laughed at her. This is the story of what happened in those 10 months and of what the ground knew that the people above it had forgotten. Lavinia Drummond came to Dakota Territory in the spring of 1887, not by the kind of romantic choice that people sometimes imagine when they think about the westward movement, but by the kind of necessity that arrives when a husband signs papers on a homestead claim and then DC before the second fence post goes into the ground. Hadley Drummond had been a steady man, a carpenter by trade in a small town outside Columbus, Ohio. When the Homestead Act made it possible to claim land for the cost of filing the paperwork and living on it for 5 years, he had seen in that opportunity what a great many men of his generation saw. A future that did not depend on someone else's workshop, someone else's prices, someone else's decisions about when you worked and when you didn't. He filed the claim. He moved his family west. He built a barn that still smelled of green lumber when the first autumn came, and he broke just enough ground to plant a small crop of winter wheat and show the land office he was serious. Then in the spring of 1888, he took ill with a fever that started in his chest and moved inward over the course of 2 weeks until there was nothing left for it to move into. On the last morning when the fever allowed him a window of clarity, Hadley looked at Lavinia from the bed in the house he had not yet finished. His voice came out thin, stripped of everything except the truth he needed her to hear. He said, "The barn still smells like new wood. I didn't get to finish the house." Lavinia sat beside him. She took his hand, the hand that had built chairs and tables and a barn in a territory he had believed in enough to cross half a country for. She said, "I'll finish it." Hadley looked at her, not with surprise, not with doubt, with the expression of a man who was seeing confirm something he had always known. He said, "I know." He died on a Tuesday morning in April with a meadowlark singing outside the window. Lavinia held his hand for a long time after it stopped holding back. She understood that every plan they had made together was now hers alone, and that the promise she had just made was not the kind that could be broken by grief or difficulty or the fact that she was now a woman alone on a piece of land that the frontier had not yet decided to let her keep. She was 33 years old. She had 2 children. Corinne was 8, sharp and quiet in the way of children who understand more than they are told. She had her father's eyes watchful and assessing, and she had a habit that Lavinia recognized as her own, the habit of standing still in the middle of a situation and looking at it from all sides before deciding what to do. Osgood was not yet 3. He laughed easily and cried hard and had no understanding of what had changed, only that his father was no longer in the chair by the stove in the mornings, and that his mother's face had taken on a quality he was too young to name but old enough to feel. The land was barely broken. The barn was solid, but the house was drafty. The nearest neighbor of any real consequence was a cattle rancher named Caspar Colgrove, who lived about 2 miles to the north. 2 miles, a distance that meant nothing in good weather and everything in bad. Lavinia had been a school teacher in Ohio before the marriage. She had taught in a one-room schoolhouse outside of Marion for 4 years, and the habits of that work had never left her. She observed things. She kept notes in a small leather journal that Hadley had given her the first Christmas after they were married. She asked questions that other people had already stopped thinking to ask, not because she was smarter than they were, but because something in her refused to accept that the way things had always been done was the same as the way things had to be done. That summer, a few months after Hadley was buried, Dr. Hewitt Gilstrap came through on his circuit. He was a lean man with spectacles that sat crooked on his nose and a leather bag that had seen more miles than most horses in the territory. He visited the scattered homesteads 2 or 3 times a year, and his arrivals were anticipated the way weather was anticipated, with a mixture of need and resignation. He examined Osgood on Lavinia's kitchen table, pressing his ear to the boy's chest, checking his eyes, his throat the color under his fingernails. Osgood squirmed and laughed and tried to grab the stethoscope, and the doctor allowed him to hold it for a moment, with the patience of a man who had learned that a child's cooperation was worth more than a child's obedience. "He's healthy," Dr. Gilstrap said. "Strong lungs, good color." Then the doctor stood on Lavinia's porch and looked out across the property, his eyes moving from the house to the barn to the distance between them. He stood there for what felt like a long time, and when he spoke, his voice carried no emotion at all. It was the voice of a man stating a measurement. "Mrs. Drummond, if this boy gets seriously ill in the middle of January, I will not reach him in time. Not because I won't try, because distance doesn't forgive in winter." Lavinia said nothing. She watched the doctor climb onto his horse and ride away down the road that connected the scattered homesteads like a frayed thread. And she stood on her porch until he was a small, dark shape against the prairie, and then she went inside and opened her journal and wrote down what he had said, word for word. She did not know yet what she would do with those words. She only knew that they had landed somewhere inside her that would not let them rest. The people who formed Lavinia's world in those first years were not a town, not a community in any organized sense. They were scattered homesteads separated by enough empty country to make every winter feel like something you survived alone or not at all. Caspar Colgrove she came to know through the small acts of mutual aid that the frontier required. He came one afternoon to help her reset a fence post that had worked loose in soft ground, and she watched him work with the careful efficiency of a man who had done this particular task 1,000 times. He checked every post before driving it, even the ones that looked solid, pressing his weight against them, testing them with his hands. She noticed this and understood it. Here was a man who believed in the proven method, who did not skip steps, who trusted what had been tested and distrusted what had not. Pernilla Treadwell lived 3 miles to the south and ran a small sheep operation with her grown son Prosper. Lavinia's first contact with Pernilla came not through the woman herself, but through Prosper, who appeared one morning with a wheel of sheep's milk cheese wrapped in cloth and a message delivered in the careful tone of a man repeating words he had been told to say. "Mother sends her regards and says if you need anything this winter, send word through me." Lavinia asked why Mrs. Treadwell hadn't come herself. Prosper was quiet for a moment, and something moved through his face that was not quite discomfort and not quite grief. It was the shadow of something old. Mother doesn't like riding past the path between another person's barn and house, he said. She has her reasons. He did not explain further, and Lavinia did not ask. But she noted the way he had said it, the weight he had given those last three words, and she understood that whatever had happened to Pernilla Treadwell on a path between a barn and a house was not the kind of thing that faded with time. Beyond the Colgrove homestead, further north past the Clarendon family, who were recent arrivals from Minnesota, still learning that the distance between where they had been and where they were would cost them before they understood it, lived an old man named Whitfield Osterhout. Whitfield spoke so rarely that the sound of his voice could startle people who hadn't heard it in months. He lived alone in a homestead that the other settlers sometimes forgot existed between visits. He owned a horse that no one ever saw him ride. He walked everywhere with the deliberate pace of a man who had arrived at some understanding with the world about how fast things needed to happen, and the answer was not fast at all. The first winter Lavinia spent on that property without Hadley taught her things that no amount of reading or conversation could have prepared her for. It taught her that cold on the Dakota plains was a different creature entirely from anything she had known in Ohio. It came through every gap in a wall. It made the wood of the house contract and groan in the night like an animal in pain. It could take a healthy person and turn them frostbitten in the time it took to walk from the front door to the woodpile, and it did this not occasionally, not during unusual weather, but routinely every January and February as a matter of course. The animals suffered in ways that mattered beyond sentiment. Livestock that got too cold stopped producing. Livestock that got colder than that simply died. And when livestock died in February, there was no fixing it until the ground thawed and a family could start over if they had anything left to start over with. But before the deepest cold of that first winter arrived, something happened in November of 1888 that would shape every decision Lavinia Drummond made for the next 3 years. She went down into the root cellar beneath the house to retrieve a jar of preserved tomatoes. The root cellar was a small space dug about 6 feet into the earth, lined with stone on 2 sides and bare dirt on the other 2, with a plank ceiling and a trap door in the kitchen floor. She had been in it dozens of times, but on this particular day, with the first real cold of the season pressing against the house above her, she stopped. She stood in the dim light and she felt something. The air underground was a different thing entirely. Not warm exactly, but not hostile. Stable. The kind of air that did not try to take something from you every time you drew a breath. She put her hand against the dirt wall and held it there. Cool but not cold. Steady as if the earth at that depth existed in its own season, indifferent to whatever was happening on the surface above. She stood there for a brief moment, her palm flat against the earth, thinking about the barn on one end of the property and the house on the other and all that frozen ground lying between them. A question took shape in her mind that would not leave for a long time. Whether the ground itself might be used as a passage away to move between the buildings without ever crossing the deadly open air above. She did not act on the thought that day. She climbed back up into the kitchen and went about her work. But the question stayed. It lodged itself somewhere deep and refused to be dislodged. 2 months later, the question found its urgency. Osgood developed a fever. He was not yet 4 small for his age, and the cough that came with it had a sound that Lavinia recognized from her teaching days, a deep rattling sound that meant the cold had gotten into his chest in a way that warmth alone might not fix. The house was freezing. The stove was burning everything she could feed it, and the heat it produced was fighting a losing battle against the wind that came through the north wall, like the wall was not there. She knew the barn was warmer, not because it was better built, but because the animals themselves generated heat, the mass of their bodies in the straw on the floor and the lower ceilings, creating a space that held temperature in a way the house could not. She made a decision that felt desperate and looked worse. She bundled Osgood in every blanket she had, wrapped herself in her heaviest coat, and carried him out the door into the night. The walk from the house to the barn was 40 steps. She counted them later. 40 steps, and in those 40 steps, the wind hit her so hard that she turned her back to it and walked the last 20 paces backward, holding Osgood against her chest, his face buried in her coat. He coughed the entire way, and each cough was a small convulsion that she felt through the blankets. When she reached the barn and got the door open and pulled it shut behind her, the difference was immediate. Not warm, not comfortable, but the absence of wind, the presence of the animals, the closeness of the walls and the straw, and the accumulated warmth of living bodies made the air something a person could breathe without feeling like the breathing itself was doing damage. She sat on the floor of the barn with her back against a hay bale and her son in her arms, and one of the milk cows turned its head and looked at her with the placid expression of an animal that did not understand anything about the situation, except that a person was sitting in its barn at a strange hour. Lavinia looked back at the quote and thought something that had no drama in it, no grand revelation, just a small practical observation that would change everything. You don't have to walk 40 steps out there to survive the night. You're already here. Osgood fell asleep against her chest. His cough eased. The heat of the barn did what the house could not, and Lavinia sat there in the dark listening to her son breathe and the animals shift and settle, and the question that had been sitting in her since November came back with a force that was no longer theoretical. She thought about those 40 steps. She thought about the air out there. She thought about the root cellar, about the temperature of that dirt wall under her palm. And the question changed shape. It was no longer about whether there was a way to connect the buildings. It was about whether the ground itself was the way. She carried Osgood back at first light, when the wind had died enough to make the crossing safe. And from that night forward, the idea was no longer a question. It was a plan waiting for the courage to begin. Lavinia spent the next 3 years observing. She did not speak about what she was thinking. She kept notes. She recorded temperatures, counted steps, tracked patterns. And in the middle of that long period of watching and writing, 2 things happened that would matter more than any temperature reading she ever took. The first was in the winter of 1889 to 1890. Lavinia went to the Colgrove homestead to return a set of tools Hadley had borrowed before he died. Caspar was not home. Ondine Colgrove invited her inside with the reflexive hospitality of a frontier wife, and Lavinia sat at the Colgrove kitchen table with coffee she had not asked for, and noticed across the room a young man sitting by the stove. Quill Colgrove was 16 then. His right leg was extended straight out on a footstool, the knee wrapped in cloth swollen beneath the wrapping. He did not look at Lavinia when she came in. His jaw was set in the way of someone who has decided that if he cannot control what has happened to his body, he can at least control whether anyone sees him reacting to it. Ondine said quietly near the door, "He's sore about the leg. Please don't mind him." Lavinia did not ask about the leg. She sat down and noticed on the table beside Quill a book on agriculture, open to a page with a diagram of an underground irrigation system. Lines drawn beneath the surface of the earth, carrying water from one place to another without ever breaking the surface. She said, "Is that book any good?" Quill looked up for the first time. His eyes were like his father's, cautious and assessing, but there was something in them that his father's eyes did not carry. Curiosity alive and impatient, pressing against the walls of the life that had been handed to him. "The part about underground irrigation is good," he said. "The rest of it's written for someone in Virginia. Doesn't apply here." Lavinia said, What does the irrigation part say? Quill looked at her for a long time the way a person looks at someone when they are deciding whether the question is real or just polite. Then he started talking. He talked about the Romans and their aqueducts, about how they moved water underground for miles, about how the earth holds moisture at a certain depth regardless of what the surface is doing, about how a pipe laid below the frost line does not freeze in winter because the ground at that depth maintains its own temperature independent of the air above. Lavinia listened. She did not say anything about her own idea. But when she left the Colgrove homestead that afternoon, she knew two things that she had not known when she arrived. The first was that Quill Colgrove had a good mind trapped inside a body that the ground had broken. The second was that somewhere inside that house, knowledge about what the earth could do already existed. It was just buried under the fear of the man who lived there. The second thing that happened during those 3 years of observation took place in the autumn of 1890, and it changed everything Lavinia understood about what she was planning to do. That was the winter Caspar Colgrove lost 4 head of cattle, the largest single-season loss he had ever taken. 2 died from the slow accumulation of cold days that wore their bodies down. 2 more were killed by a week in February when the wind blew without stopping for 6 straight days, and the barn door had to be opened and closed so many times for feeding and watering that the interior temperature never recovered. One afternoon after the worst of it had passed, Caspar came to Lavinia's property to borrow a particular type of chain she had inherited with the homestead. Lavinia poured coffee because that was what you did, and Caspar sat at her kitchen table and wrapped his hands around the cup and stared into it, and Lavinia saw something in his face that she would remember for a long time. It was not anger. It was not frustration. It was the look of a man who had done everything the way he was supposed to do it, the way his father had done it, and his grandfather before that, and who had still lost. Then Caspar said something that was not directed at Lavinia, so much as it was directed at the coffee or the stove or the accumulated weight of a lifetime spent accepting certain costs as inevitable. My father lost 6 head in the winter of '61. He said that was the price. His father said the same thing. 3 generations of men in my family accepting the same price. He drank his coffee and left. Lavinia sat at the table for a long time after he was gone. She understood now that Caspar did not believe in the old way simply because it worked. He believed in it because abandoning it would mean denying his father and his grandfather. That was not stubbornness. That was loyalty to men who were no longer alive to defend themselves. Lavinia nearly told him about her idea that afternoon. She had the words ready. She had the journal with 3 years of observations. She did not tell him. She was not ready to face what she knew would come, which was not cruelty, but something harder to push past than cruelty. It would be the polite, patient, immovable conviction that she was wrong. Then on a gray afternoon in October of 1890, old Whitfield Osterhout appeared at the edge of Lavinia's property. He was on foot, which was not unusual. Lavinia was near the barn, pacing off the distance between the barn and the house and marking the count in her journal. Whitfield watched her from the fence line for a while, standing with the stillness of a man who has grown comfortable with watching and has lost interest in being watched back. When Lavinia noticed him and walked over, he did not greet her. He did not ask what she was doing. His eyes stayed on the ground she had been pacing, and he said one thing. The Lakota knew how to use the ground. They never needed anyone to explain why. Then he turned and walked away back in the direction he had come from. Lavinia stood at the fence for a long time after he disappeared over the low-rise to the north. It was the first time since the idea had begun forming in her mind that anyone had looked at what she was doing and seen it not as madness, but as something that had existed before. something with roots in the history of the very land she was standing on. Whitfield had not encouraged her. He had not offered advice or assistance. He had simply recognized the idea as a thing that was already known. And that recognition, small as it was, gave the plan a foundation it had not had before. But if Whitfield knew, if he had known all along, then why had he never dug 30 steps of tunnel for himself? Why had he spent every winter of his solitary life walking the open ground between his barn and his door, when he understood perhaps better than anyone that the earth beneath his feet was offering something that the air above it refused to offer? The question hung there unanswered and would not be answered until after he was dead. In the autumn of 1890, Lavinia rode to the small town 12 miles east to buy supplies. The town was not much a general store, a blacksmith's forge, a feedlot, and a scattering of structures that aspired to permanence without having quite achieved it. The general store was run by Leora Sadler, a woman with sharp eyes and a mouth that moved faster than the judgment behind it. Lavinia came in with a list: rope, lamp oil, nails, quantities that were larger than a household would normally require. Leora stood behind the counter, her eyes brightening with the particular alertness of a woman who has been waiting all week for something interesting to happen. There were 3 other customers in the store. One of them was the wife of a rancher Lavinia had never met. Leora said loud enough for all of them to hear, "Mrs. Drummond, that's a lot of supplies for one woman. What are you building out there? I heard people say you've been digging." The store went quiet. 3 faces turned toward Lavinia. She could feel their eyes on her, not hostile, just curious. But curiosity in an isolated place operates like judgment, because information travels without context and transforms on the road. Lavinia paid for her supplies. She said, "I'm fixing a few things before winter," and she left. Outside on the porch, she nearly collided with a man she had not noticed on the way in. Judson Peverly was the town blacksmith, a broad man with gray hair and hands the size of small shovels. He was standing by the railing in a posture that suggested he had been there for some time, and his expression told Lavinia that he had heard the exchange through the open window. He did not ask Lavinia what she was doing. He looked at the supplies stacked on her wagon, the rope and the nails and the oil, and he looked at the dirt under her fingernails. And something in his assessment was not curious but professional. He was reading the supplies the way a man reads a blueprint, working backward from the materials to the project. He said, "I spent 11 years in the copper mines at Butte, Montana. If you're digging anything, you ought to know one thing: clay holds, sand runs. You need to know what you're digging through before it knows you." Lavinia looked at him. He was not smiling. He was not curious, not judgmental, not entertained. He was speaking in the voice of a man who had been underground long enough to know that the ground does not forgive ignorance. Lavinia said, "How do you tell the difference?" Judson said, "Squeeze a handful. If it holds its shape when you open your hand, that's clay. Safe. If it crumbles, that's sand. You brace it twice as heavy or you don't go in." He nodded once and walked into the store. They never spoke again. Lavinia wrote the words in her journal that evening. Clay holds, sand runs. She did not know it yet, but those 5 words spoken by a man she would never see again would save her life in 3 months' time. On the road home, she pulled the wagon to the side and sat still for a long while. Not from shame, not from doubt. From the realization that when she began to dig, she would not only be digging through earth, she would be digging through the opinions of every person she knew. She looked out across the prairie flat, an enormous and indifferent, and she thought about what was waiting beneath it, patient and constant, and available to anyone willing to get down on their knees and pay attention. She picked up the reins and drove home. She did not know the exact date she would begin. She knew that she would, and that the knowing was enough for now. Lavinia told Caspar Colgrove about the tunnel on a September afternoon in 1891, and she chose the moment with the same care she had applied to every observation in her journal over the previous 3 years. He had come to help her with a section of fencing that had come down in a late summer storm. This was the kind of thing neighbors did for each other in that part of the territory, not out of particular friendship, but out of the understanding that isolation made cooperation a survival requirement rather than a social nicety. They worked together for most of an hour resetting posts and stringing wire, and the rhythm of the shared labor created a space between them that felt as close to trust as anything the frontier allowed. She told him while they worked. She explained it as carefully as she could. A tunnel, an underground passage running from the barn to the grain silo, about 40 strides distant, and from there bending toward the house. All of it running beneath the frost line. All of it connected so that on the worst days of winter, she could move between her buildings without ever stepping above ground. She did not repeat the science of what she had felt in the root cellar. She did not recite her journal entries. She spoke in the language of results, the language she knew Caspar would understand. She told him what she planned to build, how she planned to build it, and what she believed it would accomplish. She was thorough and precise, and she watched his face the entire time she spoke. Caspar listened. He was a patient man respected throughout the area for his judgment, and he gave Lavinia the courtesy of hearing her out completely before he responded. When she finished, he did not speak immediately. He looked at the ground. Not at the ground the way a person looks at the ground when they are thinking. He looked at it the way a person looks at something they are afraid of. Then he told her something she had not known. 5 years earlier, his oldest boy, Quill, had been digging a well behind the barn. Quill was 15, then strong and eager and doing the work a young man does when he wants to prove he is ready for the full weight of running a place. He had dug down about 12 feet when the wall of the shaft collapsed. The earth came in on him from two sides, simultaneously burying him to the chest. It took Caspar and Undine 2 hours to dig him out. Quill survived, but his right leg, crushed beneath the weight of the compacted soil, never healed properly. He walked with a limp that he would carry for the rest of his life. Caspar said in a voice that was no longer careful, but heavy with something older than caution, "The ground is not what you think it is, Mrs. Drummond. It holds and then it takes. I've seen it take." Lavinia watched him as he spoke, and she saw the thing underneath the practical objections. The thing he could not say directly, because saying it would require admitting that his decisions since Quill's accident had been governed not by wisdom but by fear. He had watched the earth swallow his son to the chest. He could not stand the thought of it happening to her children. She thanked him. She did not argue. His fear was real, and it came from a real place, and she could not talk him out of it any more than he could talk her out of what 3 years of observation had shown her. That evening, Lavinia sat at her kitchen table and opened her journal and wrote a passage she would read again many times in the months that followed. Now I understand why Caspar looked at the ground the way he did. He was not looking at the ground. He was seeing his son underneath it. I cannot be angry at a man for that. But Quill was buried by a vertical shaft in wet soil with no supports. I am digging horizontally, shallowly, in dry ground with timber framing. Those are not the same thing, but I cannot say that to Caspar without making him hurt. And so I will say nothing, and I will dig. What Caspar told the Clarendon family the following week was different from what he had told Lavinia. Without the careful words, without the restraint he had shown out of respect, he told them that Lavinia Drummond was planning to dig the kind of hole that had nearly killed his son, and that she was going to put her children in it, and that someone ought to be paying attention before something happened that could not be undone. The words reached Lavinia through Sybil Clarendon, who rode over one afternoon looking uncomfortable, and delivered them with the reluctance of a woman who did not want to be carrying this particular message. Lavinia listened. She thanked Sybil. She said nothing else. But the story did not stop with Sybil. It traveled 12 miles east to Leora Sadler's general store carried by a customer whose name Lavinia would never learn, and Leora did what Leora always did with a good story. She told it to everyone who walked through her door. Not maliciously. Leora Sadler was not a cruel woman. She was a woman who lived in a place where very little happened, and when something did happen, the telling of it was the closest thing to entertainment the territory offered. Within 2 weeks, people Lavinia had never met knew about the widow who was digging holes in her property for her children to crawl through. Lavinia did not learn the full extent of what Laura had spread until much later. But she felt it in the way Sybil's visits grew shorter and less frequent, in the way a passing rider she did not recognize slowed his horse near her property and stared at the ground as if expecting to see evidence of something, and in the way the territory itself seemed to shift around her, contracting the small space she occupied within it. Then Pernilla Treadwell came, and everything Lavinia thought she understood about the cost of her decision was overturned by a woman who carried a different kind of cost entirely. Pernilla did not send a note. She came herself riding 3 miles on a cold morning in late September, and she sat at Lavinia's kitchen table with a cup of coffee between her hands and an expression on her face that was not the polite concern Lavinia had expected. It was something closer to dread. Pernilla said, "In this winter of 1874, I lost my husband. He went out to the barn at 3 in the morning because one of the horses was making noise. He never came back. I found him at daylight lying in the path between the barn and the house, 10 steps from the front door. 10 steps. He had made it that far." She paused. Her hands tightened around the coffee cup, and Lavinia could see the knuckles whiten beneath the weathered skin. "Are you telling me," Pernilla said, "that all it would have taken was digging a tunnel?" Lavinia was quiet for a moment. She understood now why Pernilla had come in person, why she had ridden 3 miles instead of sending Prosper with a message. This was not about whether Lavinia was right or wrong. This was about what it would mean for Pernilla if Lavinia was right. 20 years of winters, 20 years of walking the same frozen ground between house and barn that had killed her husband. 20 years of accepting that suffering as the price of living in this place. If the suffering had been unnecessary, if the answer had been in the ground the whole time, then those 20 years were not courage. They were something else. And Pernilla could not bear to name what they were. Lavinia said, "I am not telling you that Mrs. Treadwell. I am telling you that the ground holds its temperature below a certain depth, and I want to try to use that. I do not know if it would have saved anyone. I only know that I do not want to be lying in the path 10 steps from my own front door." Pernilla looked at her for a long time. Then she stood and said, "I hope that tunnel of yours does not come down on your head." And she left. That night, Lavinia could not sleep. Not because Pernilla's words had been wrong, because one of them had been right. If the tunnel collapsed, if Corinne was inside when it happened, or Osgood, then Lavinia would be the mother who killed her children with a foolish idea. Not the cold, not the wind, not the territory. Her idea. Her hands on the mattock. Her decision to open the earth and put her children inside it. She sat at the kitchen table while Corinne and Osgood slept, and she looked at them through the doorway of the bedroom, and for the first time in 3 years since the day in the root cellar, when the idea had first taken shape, she considered not doing it. She did not write in her journal that night. The page for that date remained blank, and it would remain blank for the rest of her life. The only empty page in a journal she otherwise kept with the discipline of the school teacher she had been. A single white rectangle in a book full of careful observations marking the one night when observation failed her, and there was nothing to write because the thing she was feeling had no words that would hold still long enough to be written down. In the morning, Corinne woke before her mother, which had never happened before. She came into the kitchen and found Lavinia still sitting at the table, and the child looked at her mother with the particular clarity of an 11-year-old who has been watching adults long enough to know when something is being decided. Corinne said, "Are you going to start digging today?" Lavinia looked at her daughter. The girl's face was not hopeful, not afraid, not asking for reassurance. It was the face of someone waiting to know which direction they were going so she could start walking. Corinne said, "I will help you." 4 words. Lavinia would think about those 4 words for the rest of her life. Not because they were brave, though they were. Not because they were generous, though they were that too. Because they changed what the decision meant. A moment before Corinne spoke, Lavinia had been a woman deciding alone whether to risk everything on an idea that no one believed in. A moment after, she was a woman with someone standing beside her. And the someone was 11 years old and had her father's eyes and her mother's refusal to accept the way things had always been done. Lavinia Drummond began digging on the first day of October 1891. She stood on the marked ground beside the barn with a mattock in her hands, and Corinne beside her holding a smaller spade. Osgood sat on the porch of the house watching them from across the property. The road that ran near the homestead was empty. No one was coming to help. No one was coming to watch. No one was coming at all. She drove the mattock into the earth, and the earth resisted, and she pulled it free and drove it in again. And the work began. She did not know that in 5 months, the man who carried the deepest fear of the ground would stand in her tunnel and weep. She did not know that the old man who had never laughed at her would be found dead in his own barn because he had known the answer, but had never once acted on it. She knew only that the ground beneath her feet held something that the air above it refused to hold, and she intended to find out if she was right. The first thing Lavinia learned about digging was that the ground did not yield easily. The soil on her property had been compacted by decades of seasonal cycles pressing it tighter each year, and beneath the first foot of topsoil lay a dense layer woven through with the roots of prairie grass. Every stroke of the mattock met resistance. Every spadeful of earth came up laced with pale fibers that had to be cut and pulled free before the next one could be attempted. She started with the shorter section barn to silo because she had the sense to know that a person learning the new kind of work should begin with the smaller version of it. The silo stood about 40 strides from the barn, a stone-based structure that held grain through the winter, and the passage she was digging would connect the two at a depth of roughly 4.5 feet, enough to clear the frost line by a comfortable margin, shallow enough that the work was not impossible for a woman working mostly alone. She established a method in the first 3 days. She would dig a section about 6 feet long and as wide as 2 shoulders set side by side. She would pile the excavated earth to either side. Then she would cut cottonwood logs 2 lengths from the supply she had stockpiled the previous spring, set 2 vertically as side supports as lay 1 across the top, and pack earth back over the timber roof until the passage was buried and the next section could be begun. Corinne helped after school. The subscription school 4 miles away ran 5 days a week through the autumn months, and Corinne would come home in the late afternoon and change into work clothes and join her mother in the trench without being asked. She was strong for 11, not in the way of a large child, but in the way of a child who had been doing physical work since she was old enough to carry a bucket. She hauled earth-dragged, timber-held logs in place, while Lavinia positioned them, and did all of it with a focus that Lavinia recognized as her own. Osgood helped in the way a 6-year-old helps. He carried small things and asked large questions, and occasionally sat in the trench and had to be lifted out. But he was there, and his presence mattered to Lavinia in a way she did not explain to anyone, because having both children nearby while she worked underground meant they were not somewhere else, not in the house alone, not wandering. One afternoon in the second week, Lucius Clarendon rode past while Lavinia was driving marker stakes into the ground. He was the oldest of the Clarendon children, about 20, with the easy confidence of a young man who has not yet learned what he does not know. He pulled his horse up and watched for a long time before he spoke. When Lavinia explained what she was building, he laughed. Not cruelly, the way a person laughs when they encounter something so far outside their experience. That laughter is the only response available. He said he had heard of a lot of ways to waste a good autumn, but this one was new to him. Then he rode on. Lavinia watched him go. She turned back to her stakes and did not bother recording Lucius Clarendon in her journal. He was not worth the ink. By the end of the second week, she had completed roughly a third of the barn to silo section. The connection to the silo presented the first serious technical problem. The silo sat on a stone foundation that extended about 2 feet below the surface, and the passage could not tunnel through stone. Lavinia spent 5 days on this problem before she found a solution. She angled the passage downward slightly as it approached the silo, dropping another foot in depth, and then brought it up through the earthen floor on the interior side of the foundation, creating an entry point inside the silo itself. It was rough work. The angle was steeper than she wanted, and the transition from earth wall to stone required bracing. She improvised from scrap lumber. But it worked. A person could walk from the barn through the passage and emerge inside the grain silo without ever seeing the sky. On the 19th day of digging, October the 19th, everything she thought she knew about the ground was tested. Lavinia was working alone in the first section of the longer run from silo to house. Corinne was at school. Osgood was in the house, visible through the window from where Lavinia was working if she stood up and looked. She was about 8 feet into the new section on her hands and knees with the mattock loosening earth from the face of the excavation when she heard a sound she had never heard before and would never forget. It was not loud. It was more like a whisper, a soft exhalation, the kind of sound a person makes when they settle into a chair at the end of a long day. And then the wall to her left moved, not collapsed, moved. A section of the earthen wall about 3 feet wide simply shifted inward, and with it came a cascade of loose soil that poured into the passage and covered her tools and her arms to the elbows and pushed against her body with a weight that was gentle and absolute at the same time. The space around her shrank. The passage that had been wide enough for 2 shoulders was suddenly not wide enough for one, and the earth was still moving, still settling, still pressing. Lavinia did not scream. She did not panic. She went very still in the way a person goes still when they realize that movement might make things worse. She waited. The earth settled. The sound stopped. She was not trapped. She could still move her arms, still turn, her body still see the circle of daylight at the entrance behind her. But the soil was pressed against her left side and her tools were buried, and the wall that had been solid a moment ago was now a slope of loose earth that could shift again without warning. She backed out, slowly pulling herself along the floor of the passage with her forearms, and when she reached the open air, she sat on the ground beside the trench and looked at her hands. They were shaking and she could not make them stop. She sat there for a long time, long enough for the shaking to subside and the thinking to begin. She thought about Quill Colgrove, 15 years old, 12 feet down the walls, closing on him from both sides. She understood Caspar now in a way that no amount of empathy could have provided before this moment. She understood him with her body, with the memory of earth pressing against her ribs, with the knowledge that the ground could move, that it was not passive, that it could take on its own schedule, regardless of what the person inside it wanted or planned or deserved. Then she remembered Judson Peverly, 5 words from a man she had met once outside a general store. She got up, she went back into the passage and examined the wall that had shifted. The soil in that section was different from what she had been digging through elsewhere. She picked up a handful and squeezed it and opened her hand, and the handful crumbled and fell apart. Sand. The kind of earth that holds when compressed but loses its structure the moment anything disturbs the equilibrium. She had been using the same spacing for her timber supports throughout the passage. This section needed twice the bracing. She redesigned her approach that afternoon. She doubled the number of support timbers for any section where the soil crumbled in her fist. She cut the spacing between uprights from 4 feet to 2, and she made one other change that she did not write in her journal, but that Corinne noticed and remembered for the rest of her life. She dug a second exit point at the midpoint of the long section between silo and house, a narrow vertical shaft just wide enough for a person to climb through, covered at the surface with a wooden hatch weighted down with stones. If one end of the tunnel was blocked, there would always be another way out. She did not stop digging, but the way she worked changed. Not slower, but more deliberate. She tested every wall section before moving forward. She pressed her hand against the earth and held it there, and felt for the softness that meant the soil might shift. She worked like a woman who had been taught something by the ground itself and intended to honor the lesson. That evening, Corinne came home from school quieter than usual. Lavinia asked what was wrong. Corinne did not want to say. Later, while they worked together, clearing earth from the reinforced section, Corinne said in a low voice that Lucius Clarendon had said something at school, something she had heard and did not want to repeat. Lavinia stopped working and looked at her daughter. She said, "Do you think I am wrong?" Corinne shook her head. Lavinia said, "Then we keep going." And they did. In the second week of November, something happened that Lavinia had not anticipated, and that changed the texture of her isolation in a way she was not prepared for. Reverend Stannard arrived at Caspar Colgrove's homestead for what he called a pastoral visit, but what was in practice something closer to a tribunal. He had invited Caspar, Sybil Clarendon, and Prosper Treadwell, who came on behalf of his mother, Pernilla. Lavinia was not invited. She learned about this gathering from the last person she would have expected to tell her. Lucius Clarendon, the young man who had laughed at her project from horseback 6 weeks earlier, rode to the edge of Lavinia's property on the afternoon of the meeting. He did not dismount. He sat on his horse at the fence line, looking at the mounded earth and the timber stacks and the evidence of 2 months of relentless labor. And when Lavinia walked over wiping her hands on her work clothes, he did not look at her face. He looked at the ground. He said, "Reverend Stannard is at Colgrove's place right now. He's asking people whether you're well. He's using the words welfare of the children. I thought you should know." Then he turned his horse and rode away without waiting for a response. Lavinia stood at the fence and did not move for a long time. She understood what Lucius had just done and what it had cost him. He had broken ranks. In a community, this small information was currency, and sharing it with the person it was about, rather than keeping it among the people it was shared between, was a choice that would be noticed and remembered. Lucius had not apologized for laughing at her. He had not expressed support for her project. He had simply decided that she deserved to know what was being said about her behind her back, and he had acted on that decision. The action was worth more than any words of support would have been. Lavinia did not sleep that night, but the sleeplessness was not doubt. It was calculation. She knew what Stannard's meeting meant. It meant that her project had moved beyond the category of neighborhood gossip and into the category of community concern. People were no longer merely laughing at the widow who dug holes. They were discussing whether the widow who dug holes was fit to raise her children. And in a territory where formal authority was distant and informal authority was everything, a circuit preacher asking that question in the presence of respected neighbors was not a conversation. It was a judgment being assembled. She went to Caspar's homestead the next morning. She did not wait for an invitation. She did not send word ahead. She walked the 2 miles in the early cold of the November dawn, and when Ondine Colgrove opened the door with surprise on her face, Lavinia said, "I would like to speak with your husband." Caspar came to the porch. He looked tired, as if the previous day's meeting had cost him something he had not expected to spend. Lavinia stood on his porch in the cold morning light, with her coat pulled tight and her breath visible in the air, and she said the words she had carried for 2 miles. "I understand you and Reverend Stannard have been discussing my children. I would like you to say to my face whatever you said without me present." Caspar was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice carried none of the careful diplomacy he had used when she first told him about the tunnel at the fence line in September. He sounded like a man who was exhausted by a position he had not chosen but could not abandon. He said, "Mrs. Drummond, I am not your enemy. I am a man who watched the ground swallow his son, and I am watching you take 2 children into that same ground every day. If you want to be angry at me for worrying about that, then be angry." Lavinia looked at him. She saw the weariness in his face and the pain beneath the weariness, and she understood that Caspar Colgrove was not trying to control her. He was trying to live with himself. He was trying to reconcile the part of him that respected her determination with the part that could still hear his son screaming underground, and the reconciliation was tearing him apart. She said, "I am not angry with you, Caspar. I need you to leave me alone." Caspar said, "I told Stannard to leave you be, but I also told him that I will not be the one responsible if something happens in that tunnel." Lavinia walked home. 2 miles in the November cold alone, and she dug for the rest of the day with an intensity that Corinne noticed when she came home from school and did not comment on, because the child understood that there are times when a person works hard because the work needs doing, and there are times when a person works hard because the alternative is sitting still with something that cannot be sat still with. Sybil Clarendon stopped coming by. The visits simply ceased. When Lavinia passed the Clarendon homestead on her way to collect Osgood from school one afternoon, Sybil came to the fence and waved, but she did not cross the fence, and the distance between them, 20 feet of packed earth and wooden rails, might as well have been the full breadth of the territory. Lavinia understood, in a community too small to absorb division, standing with the person everyone else was standing against was a luxury that Sybil could not afford. Lavinia did not blame her. She noted it. She kept digging. By the last week of November, the passage was nearly complete. Lavinia had been working for almost 2 months. She had dug through roots and rocks and soil that tried to collapse on her. She had redesigned her support structure after the cave-in. She had endured the community's skepticism and weathered Stannard's indirect campaign and lost her only friend and kept going. The tunnel was close enough to finished that she could stand at the house end and see by lantern light the full length of the passage stretching before her, timber supports marching into the darkness at steady intervals. Each one a decision she had made and carried out and tested and found solid. She finished on the 3rd day of December. The last section connected to a passage she had built into the back wall of the root cellar beneath her house, creating a continuous underground route from the house through the root cellar along the passage to the silo, and from the silo along the longer passage to the barn. The emergency exit at the midpoint was sealed with a fitted wooden hatch and functioning. The earthen shelves she had built at intervals held lanterns securely. The timber supports were solid, tested, and reinforced at every point where the soil had given her reason to doubt. That evening, Lavinia lit a lantern and walked the entire length of the passage with Corinne behind her. They entered through the root cellar and moved through the darkness in silence lantern light, casting their shadows long and strange against the earthen walls. Corinne reached out as she walked and placed her hand against the wall, and she kept it there the whole way, dragging her fingers along the packed earth. Lavinia glanced back and saw her daughter's face in the lantern light and saw something there that made every blister and sleepless night and shovelful of earth worth the pain. Corinne was not afraid. She was not uncertain. She was touching the wall of the tunnel the way a person touches something they helped build with a sense of ownership that no one could take from her because she had earned it with her own hands. They walked through to the barn and stood among the animals, and then walked back, and when they emerged into the root cellar and climbed up into the kitchen, Corinne said nothing, and Lavinia said nothing, and they sat at the table and ate supper in a silence that was not empty but full, the kind of silence that exists between people who have finished something together and do not need to discuss what it means, because the meaning is in their hands and their shoulders and the dirt still under their fingernails. December came in cold but manageable. The tunnel held, and somewhere to the north, past Caspar Colgrove's homestead, past the Clarendon place, Whitfield Osterhout was still walking 30 steps of open ground between his barn and his house every day, the way he had walked it every winter for more years than anyone could count. He had spoken one sentence to Lavinia about the ground. He had recognized what she was building as something already known. And he had gone home and continued living the way he had always lived, in a house with no passage on a homestead, with no tunnel 30 steps from his barn, with nothing between him and the sky, except the air that would in 3 months' time refuse to let him cross. January arrived and everything changed. Lavinia rose before full light each morning and entered the passage through the root cellar and walked to the barn in her house dress and work boots, carrying a lantern, moving through the underground air, the way a person moves through a hallway in their own home. No layers of heavy clothing, no bracing against wind, no desperate march across frozen ground. She simply walked. When she arrived at the barn, the animals were calm, because her arrival did not bring with it the blast of frigid air that had accompanied every previous winter entrance when the barn door was hauled open against the wind. The door stayed closed. The cold stayed outside. And the difference that this single change made accumulated faster than Lavinia had expected. The cows continued to produce milk through the deepest cold. The horses maintained their weight. The pigs gained steadily. Lavinia measured her firewood supply against her projected usage, and by the second week of January, the difference was significant enough that she underlined the notation in her journal twice. She was burning roughly a third less than she had burned in either of the previous 2 winters. She did not go to her neighbors with this information. She recorded it and continued. In early February, Caspar Colgrove stopped by. He had not been to Lavinia's property since the morning she had confronted him on his own porch in November, and the fact that he came at all told Lavinia something about the state of his own winter. She invited him in. She poured coffee. She told him only the results, without theory, without argument. The cows were milking, the horses were holding, the pigs were gaining, the wood was lasting. Caspar sat with his coffee and listened, and his face showed the particular expression of a man who wants to believe something and cannot quite allow himself to get there. He said he was glad her animals were doing well. He said nothing about trying it himself. Then he said something Lavinia did not expect. Quill asked after you. He wants to know how you manage the digging. Lavinia looked at him with surprise she could not hide. Caspar continued, I told him he is not to come here, but he asks every week. Lavinia said he is welcome anytime, Caspar. Caspar stood and put on his hat and paused at the door. He said, I hope you are right about this, Mrs. Drummond. I hope you are right more than I have ever hoped anyone was right about anything. Then he added, still facing the door, still not looking at her. Quill told me something a few months back. He said that if water can travel underground, then people can too. He'd read it in a book. I told him to be quiet about it. He pulled the door open and the cold came in around him. Now I hear you saying the same thing he said, and I don't know what to do with that. He left. Lavinia stood at the door and understood something she had not fully grasped before. When Caspar had heard her describe the tunnel at the fence line in September, he was not only hearing her, he was hearing his own son's voice, the voice he had silenced, saying the same thing from a different direction. His reaction had been so fierce, not because Lavinia was a stranger with a strange idea, but because the idea had already been inside his own house, spoken by his own boy, and he had shut it down. Every objection he raised against Lavinia was an objection he had already raised against Quill, and every day the tunnel proved itself was a day that proved he had been wrong twice. February passed. The tunnel held. The timber supports showed no sign of stress. The emergency exit remained dry and functional. Lavinia's animals were healthier than they had been at any point since she arrived in the territory. Then March came. The temperature had been dropping for several days in a way that felt different from ordinary cold. Not the sharp brightness of a clear winter mim. This was a pressing cold, heavy and deliberate, accompanied by a sky that turned the color of old iron, and a wind that did not gust, but simply leaned against everything with a patience that suggested it had no intention of ever stopping. The horses at the Clarendon place would not settle the afternoon before it hit. They walked their stalls in circles and refused to eat, and no amount of talking or feed or familiar presence could calm them. Pernilla Treadwell told Prosper that her sheep had packed themselves into the corner of the barn that morning in a formation she had seen only once before years ago in Minnesota, just before the worst storm of her life. On the afternoon before the storm arrived, Undine Colgrove came to Lavinia's homestead. She came alone. She did not tell Caspar she was coming. She stood at Lavinia's door with her coat pulled tight, and the first flakes of what was coming already visible in the air behind her, small and hard and moving sideways, and she said, "If it gets bad, can I bring the children here?" Lavinia looked at her. Undine Colgrove, who had opened the door with surprise on the morning Lavinia came to confront Caspar. Undine, who had stayed inside while her husband and Lavinia exchanged words that carried the weight of old wounds. Undine, who had not visited, had not sent word, had not taken any visible side. She was here now because the animals were circling in their stalls, and the sky looked like something she had never seen before, and the instinct that keeps a mother's children alive was stronger than every other calculation. Lavinia said, "Bring Caspar too." Undine shook her head slowly. "He won't come." Then she said something else, standing in the doorway with the wind beginning to pick up behind her. Something she delivered in the flat tone of a woman who has been carrying it for months and is setting it down because there may not be another chance. "He argued with me 3 times about you. Every time he talked about Quill. Every time I told him he was afraid of the wrong thing. He doesn't listen to me, but he listens to storms. Tonight he'll listen." She turned and walked to her horse and rode home, and Lavinia stood in the doorway and understood that Undine Colgrove had just done something that was going to cause difficulty in her marriage, and had done it anyway. She understood that the arguments between Caspar and Undine had been happening for months behind the closed door of a homestead 2 miles north, and that Undine had been fighting for Lavinia's idea inside her own house in ways that Lavinia would never fully know. There is a kind of courage in that, different from digging a tunnel, no less real. Whitfield Osterhout was seen for the last time that afternoon. A neighbor passing on the road spotted him walking from his woodpile toward his house, moving with the careful, deliberate steps of an old man who knows that the ground beneath him might be icy and that a fall at his age could be the beginning of the end. He reached his door and went inside, and no one saw him again. The storm arrived before midnight. By morning, the world outside had been replaced by a moving white wall that drove snow horizontal with a sound that was less like wind and more like a sustained pressure against the ears, constant and enormous, as if the atmosphere itself had decided to lean its full weight against every structure that human hands had built and test whether any of them deserved to remain standing. The temperature went to a place where numbers ceased to communicate anything useful. Windows became walls sealed with driven snow so dense and uniform that the glass behind it might as well not have existed. The house creaked and shifted sounds that carried an urgency Lavinia had not heard before, as if the structure were negotiating with something that wanted it gone. Lavinia checked the tunnel entrance and found it sound. She made her morning rounds without stepping above ground. She stoked her stove. She fed her children. She settled in to wait. The storm ran for 3 days, not 3 days of blizzard in the way most people understand that word, where the wind howls and then it stops and you dig out. This was 3 continuous days of sustained assault, without pause, without respite, without a single moment in which a person could step outside and take the measure of what was happening. Osgood woke on the first morning and would not stop crying. He was not sick. He was not hurt. He was afraid, and the fear was the kind that has no object, the kind that comes from the sound of something vast happening just beyond the walls, something the body registers as danger, even when the mind has no name for it. Corinne tried everything. She talked to him, held his hands, sat beside him, told him stories. None of it worked because the sound was everywhere, filling the house, occupying every space that silence would normally hold. Corinne looked at her mother. Lavinia nodded. Corinne took her brother by the hand and led him to the trapdoor in the kitchen floor. They climbed down into the root cellar and from there into the passage, and the moment they descended below the surface, the storm ceased to exist as an audible event. Not gradually, not in stages. The packed walls and the timber ceiling and the weight of the soil above them removed the storm from the world entirely, or at least from the world that Osgood and Corinne occupied. In that sudden silence, Osgood stopped crying and looked around with the startled expression of a child who has walked through a door and found a different season on the other side. Corinne walked him through the passage to the barn. The lantern swayed in her hand and their shadows moved along the walls. When they reached the barn, Osgood sat down next to one of the milk cows and leaned against her flank and closed his eyes, and the cow turned her head and regarded him with mild curiosity and went back to chewing, and Osgood fell asleep within minutes. Corinne walked back through the passage alone. She emerged in the kitchen and said, "He is asleep in the barn. It is quiet down there." Lavinia said, "I know." Corinne said, "I think the tunnel does not just keep out the cold." Lavinia looked at her daughter and understood that her 12-year-old had just named something Lavinia had felt but had not yet put into words. The passage did more than connect buildings. It created a space where the worst thing happening above could not reach. Not permanently, not as an escape from life, but as a pause. A place to collect yourself before going back up to face whatever was waiting on the surface. Lavinia retrieved Osgood before noon and spent the rest of the first day doing the work of survival in a way she had never experienced before. She fed the animals twice walking through the passage, each time carrying feed in a sack over her shoulder, arriving in the barn to find the animals calm, the air steady, the storm a rumor from another country. She checked the timber supports and found them solid. She checked the emergency exit and found the hatch secure. The stove held its heat because the doors stayed closed. The house held its warmth because the passage had made the doors unnecessary. And Lavinia sat at her kitchen table in the evening, with both children fed and warm and sleeping, and she listened to the storm raging above, and she felt something she recognized from a long time ago, from before Hadley died, from the years when the future had felt like something you could plan for. On the second day of the storm in the early afternoon, someone knocked on Lavinia's front door. The sound was so unexpected that she stood motionless for several seconds before she understood what it was. No one should have been outside. The knock came again, weaker. Lavinia crossed the kitchen and opened the door and found Caspar Colgrove on her porch. He looked like a man who had crossed through something that was not meant to be crossed. Frost covered his beard and eyebrows and the front of his coat so thick that the fabric had stiffened into something that was no longer cloth. His hat was gone. His right hand hung at his side with two fingers extended in a way that was rigid and wrong, and Lavinia understood immediately that those fingers were no longer under his control. His eyes were focused, but focused on something behind the surface of the present moment, and Lavinia had seen that look before on the faces of men who had been pushed past the boundary, where the body handles things automatically, and the mind has to take over every function one by one. She grabbed his arm and pulled him inside and closed the door against the wind that followed him in. She sat him in the chair closest to the stove. She poured coffee. She wrapped his right hand in a cloth soaked in water that was warm, but not hot, because she knew that too much heat too fast on frozen tissue could cause more damage than the cold itself. She did not ask what had happened. She gave him time. Caspar sat with the coffee and the warm cloth, and for a long time he did not speak. He moved his left hand in the involuntary way of a person testing whether everything still functions, opening and closing, his fingers rotating his wrist, performing the small negotiations between will and nerve that a body conducts when it is unsure whether the contract between them still holds. When the color began to return to his face, he spoke. His voice was rough, scraped thin by cold air and exertion. "My hogs died in the night." Lavinia said nothing. She waited. "I went to the barn this morning to check on the others. 60 steps. I fell twice. The second time I was not sure I would get up." He looked at his right hand inside the cloth. "I cannot feel these two fingers. I do not know if they will come back." Lavinia said, "They might. Keep them warm. Do not rub them." Caspar looked up at her. She saw the question forming before he asked it, saw the resistance and the need fighting each other in his expression, saw the man he had been for 50 years struggling against the man he was right now. He said, "Ondine told me she came to see you before the storm. She told me what you said." Lavinia said, "I said to bring you too." Caspar nodded slowly. He said, "I would not come." Lavinia said, "I know." A silence settled between them. The heavy silence of two people standing on either side of something that one of them has been right about and the other has been wrong about. And both of them knowing it and neither wanting to say it first, because saying it would change the shape of everything that had passed between them. Caspar said, "I would like to see it, the tunnel." Lavinia led him to the trapdoor. They descended into the root cellar and from there into the passage. Caspar had to duck his head. His shoulders nearly touched both walls. He placed his left hand, the one that still had feeling, against the earthen wall as they walked, and he held it there, and Lavinia watched his face in the lantern light and saw the moment when he registered what his palm was telling him. She saw the moment when his body, which had been clenched and guarded and braced for days, began to release. His shoulders dropped. His breathing changed. The rigid alertness in his posture softened into something that was not relaxation, but was the nearest thing to it that he had experienced in 72 hours. They walked through to the barn, and Lavinia opened the passage door, and the barn was quiet and warm in the way that only a barn full of healthy animals in winter can be. Her cows stood in their stalls chewing steadily. The horses breathed in long, even rhythms. The pigs moved about their pen with the unhurried confidence of animals that had no reason to be anxious. Not one of them showed the hollow, desperate look that Lavinia had seen in livestock driven to their limit. Caspar stood in that barn and looked at the animals for a long time. Lavinia stood beside him and let him look. She did not explain. She did not point out evidence. The evidence was breathing calmly and chewing hay, and it did not need her help. Caspar turned to her. His eyes were red. He said, "Undine cried all night over those hogs." Lavinia said, "I am sorry, Caspar." He said, "If I had not been afraid of the digging, those hogs might still be alive." Lavinia did not respond to that because there was nothing she could say that would not either minimize his pain or magnify it, and neither of those was what he needed. He needed to stand in the truth of what he was saying and let it settle into him the way the temperature of the earth had settled into his palm. Caspar said quietly in the voice of a man making a statement that he knows will follow him for the rest of his life, "I was wrong about this, Mrs. Drummond." He paused. Then he said, his voice breaking on the second word, "And I owe you more than just saying so." Lavinia poured him a second cup of coffee when they returned to the kitchen. She did not say anything more about the tunnel or the animals or the winter or the storm. There are moments when silence is the only kindness available, and this was one of them. Caspar sat by her stove and drank his coffee and stared into the fire, and Lavinia understood that he was not mourning two hogs. He was mourning every winter he had endured the old way, every animal he had lost, every frozen morning he had dragged himself across 60 steps of open ground, because that was how things were done. And deeper than that, in a place he would probably never speak about aloud, he was thinking about Quill and the fact that his son had said the same thing Lavinia had proved, and he had told the boy to be quiet. Caspar did not go home that evening. The storm was still raging. Lavinia gave him a blanket, and he lay down on the floor beside the stove, and she saw him close his eyes and then open them again and stare at the ceiling for a long time before sleep took him. She understood that he was replaying the walk from his homestead to hers, calculating what it would have meant if he had not made it, if he had fallen a third time, if Undine had found him in the morning, the way Pernilla Treadwell had found her husband 2 decades ago. In the morning, Caspar woke early before the children stirred. Without saying anything to Lavinia, he went to the trap door and descended into the root cellar and walked through the passage to the barn. Alone. Lavinia heard the trap door open and close. She stood at the kitchen window and waited. She did not follow him. She understood that what Caspar was doing had to be done alone, because it was not about the tunnel. It was about the ground. It was about putting himself back inside the earth that had taken his son's leg and finding out whether he could stand it, whether the fear that had governed 5 years of his decisions was something he could walk through one step at a time, trusting that the floor was solid even when he could not see it. He came back to the kitchen 10 minutes later. He did not say anything about what he had felt or seen or thought. He sat at the table and Lavinia put coffee in front of him, and they sat in the early morning quiet and listened to the storm still pressing against the walls, and Caspar's hands were steady. His color was good. He was breathing the way a person breathes when they have decided something, settled and slow. And Lavinia knew without asking that something had changed in him that would not change back. The storm broke on the morning of the third day. The wind died in stages, pulling back like a tide, and by midday the sky was visible for the first time in 72 hours, pale and washed and impossibly high. The snow lay in drifts that reached roof lines and left other patches scoured bare, the landscape rearranged as if the storm had rewritten the geography. Caspar left that afternoon. He walked home through the drifts, moving slowly, stopping often, and Lavinia stood on her porch and did not go inside until he had disappeared over the rise to the north. Then the news about Whitfield came. A neighbor passing by Whitfield Osterhout's homestead 4 days after the storm noticed that no smoke was rising from the chimney. The front door was closed. The barn door was closed. Everything looked orderly from a distance, but there was no smoke, and no smoke meant no fire, and no fire meant no one was tending it. They found Whitfield in his barn. He was sitting against the back wall near the stall where he kept his one remaining horse. The horse was alive, thin, and agitated, but alive. Whitfield was not. He had made it to the barn before the worst of the storm hit, probably to check on the horse, probably with the intention of returning to the house as soon as the animal was settled. 30 steps back to his front door, and the storm had made those 30 steps lethal. He had waited in the cold in the barn without a stove, had done what it always does when it has enough time. Dr. Gilstrap arrived the same day, making his way through the drifts to examine both the living and the dead. He checked Whitfield's body and he checked Caspar's hand, and he spoke to Lavinia afterward in the same flat factual tone he had used on her porch 4 years earlier. Mr. Osterhout died of exposure, lost consciousness within 4 or 5 hours. If he had a way back to the house without going outside, he would be alive. Then the doctor looked at Caspar's hand, the 2 fingers that were swollen but regaining color, and he said, "These will recover. You treated them correctly. If he had been out there another 15 minutes, I would have had to remove them." 2 statements, no emotion. One confirmed that what Lavinia had built could save a life. The other confirmed that it had. Lavinia heard the full account of Whitfield's death from Prosper Treadwell, who rode to her homestead the day after Whitfield was found. She stood on her porch and listened and said nothing, and when Prosper finished, she thanked him and went inside and sat at her kitchen table and did not move for a long time. She thought about the afternoon in October of 1890 when Whitfield had stood at her fence and spoken his one sentence. She thought about the way he had looked at the ground she had been pacing with recognition, as if he were watching someone finally do a thing he had always known needed doing. She thought about the fact that he had lived alone on that homestead for longer than anyone could say for certain, and that in all those years and all those winters, he had never dug a passage between his barn and his house. 30 steps. She had made that distance irrelevant with 2 months of work and a mattock and a stubborn refusal to accept that the space between buildings had to be crossed the way it had always been crossed. Whitfield had known the answer, named it aloud, and gone home and continued living the way he had always lived. And the way he had always lived had killed him. Lavinia did not know why he had never acted. Perhaps the solitude itself, the way that living alone long enough can make a person accept conditions that a person with family would fight against. Perhaps age, the gradual narrowing of what seems possible. Perhaps he simply did not believe that one old man's comfort was worth the labor. Or perhaps, and this was the thought Lavinia could not put down, he had no one to build it for. No Corinne to say 4 words on an October morning. No small boy sleeping against a cow's flank. No reason to dig except himself, and himself had not been enough. That evening, after the children were asleep, Lavinia wrote one line in her journal. Whitfield knew. He knew before I did. But knowing without acting is the same as not knowing at all. She sat with the journal open after she wrote it, and she was not sure the sentence was true. She was not sure it was fair. But it was what she had, and she wrote it down because the alternative was the blank page, and she had learned what a blank page cost. The accounting of Lavinia's homestead after the storm was as follows. No livestock lost. not one animal. Her children had not missed a single day of warmth or safety. Her woodpile, when she measured it against her projections, still held close to a third of the season's supply. She had not set foot outside her buildings for the 3 worst days of the worst winter in the territory's memory, and everything that needed tending had been tended. Spring came. The ground softened, and the people who had laughed and worried and warned and whispered began one by one to come back. Caspar came first. He arrived in April with dirt on his boots and a purpose in his bearing that Lavinia recognized because she had carried it herself the previous autumn. He said he was thinking of digging a shorter version just barn to house, and he asked if she would be willing to walk him through what she had learned. She said she would be glad to. He brought someone with him. Quill Colgrove stood behind his father in the yard with the particular stillness of a young man who has been told he is not allowed to be here and has come anyway. He was about 20, lean, with a face that resembled his father's in the jawline and the set of the eyes, and he walked with a limp on his right side that was visible but did not slow him. Caspar looked at his son and then looked at Lavinia, and something passed between the two adults that did not require words. An acknowledgement that the boy's presence meant the prohibition had been lifted and that lifting it had cost Caspar something he was choosing to pay. Quill walked the tunnel in silence. When he emerged, he did not comment on the temperature or the structure. He asked one question. You used cottonwood for the framing. Would oak hold up better if a person could source it? Lavinia said oak would last considerably longer. Quill nodded. It was the shortest and most consequential exchange in this entire story. A young man whose leg the ground had broken asking a practical question about a practical problem. The future reaching for the work with both hands while the past stood behind him, trying to let go. Before they left, Quill turned back to look at the tunnel entrance one more time. He said to Lavinia, not to his father, I know what the ground can do because it did it to me, but you know what the ground can do because you listened to it. Those aren't the same kind of knowing. Caspar heard. He said nothing. But the way he put his hand on his son's shoulder as they walked away, heavier than necessary, held longer than casual, said more than any words he could have found. It was the gesture of a man who was doing two things at once and finding that both of them fit inside a single motion. He was apologizing and he was letting go. Lucius Clarendon came next. He walked the tunnel end to end without speaking. When he came out into the daylight, he asked about the timber and whether the spring thaw had caused any problems. Lavinia showed him the one section that had needed reinforcement and explained what she had done. He listened carefully. Before he left, Lucius stopped at his horse and stood with one hand on the saddle and said without turning around, I was the one who came to tell you about Stannard last November. Lavinia said she remembered. Lucius said, I was also the one who laughed at you in October. I want you to know that I remember both of those things. Then he mounted and rode away, and Lavinia stood at the fence and let him go without speaking. What he had done was not an apology. An apology would have been simpler and easier and would have cost less. What he had done was acknowledge the contradiction in his own behavior, name it out loud and leave it standing in the air between them without trying to explain it away or ask for forgiveness. It was the kind of honesty that does not seek resolution, and Lavinia respected it more than she would have respected any apology he could have offered. Sybil Clarendon came on a morning in late April carrying a basket that was clearly more than a casual gift. She stood in Lavinia's kitchen and did not sit down. She said, I should have come sooner. Lavinia said, you came, that is enough. Sybil's eyes filled and she set the basket on the table and left without saying anything else. Lavinia unpacked it and found bread and preserves and dried meat and a small jar of honey that must have cost Sybil dearly, and she understood that the basket was not food. It was the weight of 4 months of silence being set down. Pernilla Treadwell sent Prosper with a jar of preserves and a letter. The letter was brief, written in the careful hand of a woman who does not waste words. It said she was glad the idea had proved out. It said she had thought about it through the winter, and that Lavinia had been right, and the rightness did not diminish what Pernilla had survived, but it did change the way she understood it. At the bottom in smaller writing, as if she had added it after the letter was finished and sealed and then opened again, Pernilla had written something that Lavinia read several times. I think about my husband lying in the path 10 steps from the door. I used to think about it as the price of this life. Now I think about it as something that did not have to happen. That is a harder thought, but I believe it is a truer one. It was the most honest thing anyone had said to Lavinia since the project began. Reverend Stannard came by on his spring circuit. He did not ask to see the tunnel. He did not enter the house. He stood in the yard and said, "I am glad your family is safe, Mrs. Drummond." Then he left. He did not apologize. He did not acknowledge the meeting he had convened or the words he had used. He simply retreated. And Lavinia let him retreat because she had learned something about victory in the months since she had driven that first mattock stroke into the earth. Victory does not need to be announced. It only needs to be lived. Leora Sadler rode 12 miles from town on a morning in May, the first time she had ever come to Lavinia's homestead. She wanted to hear the full story, and the eagerness in her face was the eagerness of a woman who has found a new tale to tell behind her counter. Lavinia looked at her. She remembered the afternoon in the general store, the question asked in front of 3 customers, the way information had traveled from that counter in every direction without her consent. She said, "Mrs. Sadler, you are welcome to coffee, but my story is not for telling over a counter." Lyra sat. She drank her coffee. She looked around the kitchen, at the trap door in the floor, at the journal on the shelf, at the hands of the woman sitting across from her. For the first time in anyone's memory, Leora Sadler did not seem to know what to say. She rode home. What she told her customers afterward, no one could say for certain. But the tone of the telling, according to those who heard it, was different. Less curiosity, something closer to respect. By the autumn of 1893, 3 properties in that part of the territory had underground passage systems connecting their buildings. Caspar Colgrove's ran from his barn to his house, shorter than Lavinia's, built with oak timbers that Quill had sourced from a stand of trees along a creek bed 20 miles to the east. Quill had done most of the digging himself, working through the limp, and the passage he built was sturdier and better braced than Lavinia's original, improved by the lessons she had shared and the questions he had asked. The Clarendon family built a passage from their barn to a root cellar they expanded to serve as a central hub. Prosper Treadwell dug a short connection between the sheep barn and the house, working alone over the course of 3 weeks. And when he finished, he rode to Lavinia's homestead and stood in her yard and said his mother wanted her to know it was done. Lavinia said she was glad. None of the systems were exactly like Lavinia's. Each adapted to its own ground and its own needs and the temperament of the person who built it. But all of them drew directly from what she had worked out alone 2 autumns before, a woman with no engineering training and no construction experience, and no support from anyone except a 12-year-old girl who had said 4 words on an October morning that changed everything. Lavinia remarried in 1896. Milo Redmond came from Pennsylvania, a quiet man with practical skills and the kind of intelligence that shows itself not in conversation, but in the way a person looks at a problem and sees what needs doing without being told. Lavinia told Corinne years later that what she loved about Milo was that he had arrived at the homestead and looked at the tunnel and asked how it worked, and never once asked why she had built it. He understood the why the moment he walked through it. The passage was expanded twice after Milo arrived. It tended to include a small outbuilding he used for equipment, and the original barn section was re-timbered with hardwood when the cottonwood logs began to show their age. Corinne grew up and married and moved to the eastern part of the state, and in the letters she wrote to her own children decades later, she returned again and again to the memory of walking through that tunnel with a lantern on January mornings when she was a girl. She wrote that it felt like moving through the inside of something alive. The earth held its warmth the way a living thing holds warmth, she said, steady and unhurried, indifferent to whatever the sky was doing. She wrote about her mother's hands, the way they had changed over those 2 months of digging, and she wrote that she had never seen hands more beautiful than those, not because they were smooth or elegant, but because they carried the evidence of everything they had built. Lavinia and Milo sold the homestead in 1921 and moved east to be closer to their grandchildren. A section of the original passage was still in use as a root storage area as late as the 1930s, according to the family that bought the property long past the time when anyone thought of it as something remarkable. Because the remarkable had become the ordinary, the way the best ideas eventually do. Someone builds a thing that no one has seen before, and the neighbors resist it, and then they adopt it, and then their children grow up with it, and within a generation, it is simply how things are done, and the name of the person who first drove a mattock into the earth and started digging is forgotten by everyone except the family that carries it. Lavinia Drummond was not an engineer. She had no formal training in construction or agriculture or geology or any of the fields that might have told her in advance whether her idea would work. She had a journal. She had a mattock and a spade. She had 2 months of October and November before the ground froze solid. She had the memory of standing underground on a cold day and feeling something that every person around her had access to feeling, but that only she had stopped long enough to think about and only she had been willing to act on. The community that doubted her was not composed of foolish people. Caspar Colgrove was a competent man with a competent man's reasons for his fear. Pernilla Treadwell had survived more than most people will ever be asked to survive. The Pratts were capable farmers learning a new landscape. They all stood on the same ground. They all felt the same cold. They all had access to the same observation that Lavinia had made in that root cellar in November of 1888. What Lavinia had that they did not, at least not in that moment, was the willingness to follow a familiar observation to a place where following it looked foolish. That is a particular kind of courage that is easy to underestimate because it does not look like courage from the outside. From the outside, it looks like stubbornness or eccentricity, or a woman who has been alone too long and has gotten peculiar ideas. It looks that way right up until the moment when the storm comes and the tunnel holds and the animals live and the children are warm and the man who said she was wrong is standing in her barn with tears in his eyes. And then it does not look like stubbornness anymore. It looks like what it always was. A woman who paid attention to what the ground was telling her and had the nerve to act on it when no one else would. Lavinia Drummond died in 1934 in a house in the eastern part of the state, far from the homestead where she had dug her tunnel. Corinne was with her. The last entry in her journal, written in a hand that was still steady at 79, was not about the tunnel or the storm or the winter of 1892. It was about the garden she could see from her bedroom window and the way the light fell across it in the late afternoon and the fact that the tomatoes were coming in well this year. She had always been a woman who noticed things. She noticed things right to the end.